The organ at Fenwick Chapel had been playing for 20 minutes when it stopped. Not a gradual diminuendo, not a trailing of notes into silence. It stopped, as organs sometimes do, between one breath and the next. And the silence it left behind was the particular silence of 300 people who had not yet understood that something was wrong. Lady Harriet Colbourne stood at the altar in ivory silk and October light, her hands steady at her sides, her eyes on the vicar who had just opened his book. She was 34 years old, twice composed, and she had spent 3 months deciding that what she did not know could not harm her. She was about to discover the precise cost of that decision. Oliver Ashwood, Marquess of Fenwick, stood at her left, and in the interval between the organ's last note and the vicar's first word, he turned, not toward her, but toward the assembled pews, and said something. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The chapel was stone, and the silence was complete, and every syllable carried to the back row as cleanly as a bell. Harriet heard each word. She did not move for 3 counted seconds. Then she turned from the altar, and the sound of her heels on the marble floor was the only sound in Fenwick Chapel for a very long time. The phrase Oliver Ashwood spoke was this: it was always her, even on their wedding day. He did not finish the sentence before Harriet was walking. She did not run. She did not look at the congregation as she passed, not at the faces turned toward her, not at the candles guttering in the draft of her movement, not at the great stone pillars that had witnessed the Ashwood family's ceremonies for 2 centuries. She looked at the doors. They were heavy oak, iron-banded, and they opened outward. And when she pushed through them, the October light came in behind her like something that had been waiting. She heard the doors close. She did not look back to see whether Oliver had moved. He had not moved. He stood at the altar with his hands at his sides and his face turned toward the closed doors. And the 300 guests sat in their pews in the kind of silence that follows an event no one has the vocabulary to describe. The vicar closed his book. Harriet's carriage was waiting in the forecourt because carriages are always waiting, because the machinery of a wedding operates on its own momentum long after the wedding itself has ceased. The coachman, Thomas, had been with the Fenwick household for 11 years and had driven in worse weather than this. He helped Harriet in without a word, because her expression was one that did not invite words, and he closed the door behind her and climbed to his box and drove. Inside the carriage, Harriet's lady's maid, a woman named Price, who had been with Harriet since before the first marriage, sat across from her with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes fixed on a point somewhere below the carriage window. She did not ask. She had heard what the 300 guests heard. She understood that asking was not what was required. Harriet sat with her back straight and her hands in her lap and said nothing for the full 20 minutes of the drive back to Fenwick House. The October countryside moved past the window, the elms, the folded fields, the stone walls that had been there longer than the title. And she watched none of it. She was doing something that looked from the outside like stillness, but was in fact a very precise kind of accounting. She had found the letters in July, 3 months before the wedding, in the small writing desk in Oliver's study at Fenwick House, where she had gone to retrieve a book she had left there. The desk was unlocked. She had not been searching. The letters were tied with a green ribbon that had faded to the color of old sage, and the handwriting on the outside of the bundle was a woman's. And the name on the first letter was Oliver's Christian name, written in a hand that knew it well. She had not opened them. She had read the direction on the outside of the first letter, and the date, 8 years prior, and she had replaced the bundle in the desk and closed the drawer, and stood in the middle of the study for a long moment before she went back to what she had been doing. She had told herself, over the following weeks, that old letters meant old feelings, and that a man who had loved someone 8 years ago was not a man who loved someone now. She had told herself that the quality of Oliver's attention toward her, the particular way he had of reading her face before she had finished forming a thought, the steadiness of his presence in a room, was not the behavior of a man whose heart was elsewhere. She had told herself these things carefully and with some conviction. She thought about them now, in the carriage, with the October light going gray and the sound of the horses on the road. She thought about the evening 3 years ago when she had first understood that Oliver Ashwood was paying a specific kind of attention to her. A drawing room in Derbyshire, a dinner party that had gone on too long, the fire burning too high, and the candles adding their heat to the room, until the air near the ceiling had thickened with smoke and conversation. She had not yet formed the thought that she needed air. She was still sitting, still attending to the woman beside her, still performing the small courtesies of a dinner party, when she felt a hand at her elbow. Light, certain, not a question. Oliver's voice, low, asking whether she might like to see the garden. And she had looked up at him and understood that he had seen what she had not yet admitted to herself, that she needed to breathe. They had stood in the garden for 10 minutes. He had not made conversation. He had simply stood beside her while she breathed the cold air. And when she had said after a while that she was ready to go back in, he had said very simply, "Good," and they had gone back in. She had thought about that evening many times since. She thought about it now, in the carriage, and understood for the first time what she had been doing when she thought about it. She had been using it as evidence that he saw her, that the attention was real. It was real, she thought. That was not the question. The question was whether it had ever been the only thing in the room. Fenwick House was quiet when the carriage arrived. The staff had been given the afternoon for the wedding celebrations, and only the housekeeper, Mrs. Alderton, was present in the entrance hall when Harriet came through the door. Mrs. Alderton looked at Harriet's face and said nothing beyond the necessities of welcome. And Harriet went upstairs without stopping. She began packing before Price arrived to assist her. And when Price came through the door and found her already at the wardrobe, Price said only, "Shall I bring the larger trunk, my lady?" And Harriet said yes, and they worked in silence. Harriet packed with a precision that had nothing to do with haste and everything to do with clarity. She took what was hers before the marriage. The clothes she had bought with her widow's income, the books she had arrived with, a dozen volumes, some annotated in her own hand, one given to her by her first husband's sister, who had been kinder than the husband, and one miniature portrait in a tortoiseshell frame, a likeness of her maternal grandmother that Oliver had seen perhaps twice and would not have been able to identify. She left the jewelry he had given her. She left the dressing gown he had ordered made for her in a shade of blue he said matched her eyes, which it did. She left the copy of Cowper's poems she had borrowed from his library and not yet returned. When she lifted the gray wool pelisse from its hook, a garment she had bought in Bath before she had met him, before the second chapter of her life had begun. She held it for a moment without folding it. She was thinking about the letters, not about who had written them, about herself, standing in his study in July, holding the bundle in both hands, reading the direction on the outside of the first letter, and then, deliberately, with full knowledge of what she was choosing, putting them back. She had told herself it was trust. She wondered now whether it had been fear. There was a difference, she thought, between trusting a man and choosing not to know what you might not be able to bear. She had called it the former. She was no longer certain it had not been the latter. And that uncertainty, not Oliver's words in the chapel, not the 300 witnesses, not the doors opening onto October light. That was the thing she was going to have to live with. She folded the police and placed it in the trunk. Oliver wrote to her 3 times over the following 4 days. The first letter arrived the morning after the wedding. The second arrived 2 days later. The third arrived on the 4th day, and it was thicker than the others, which meant he had written more, or had written and crossed out and written again. Harriet received each letter from the hall tray, read the direction written in his hand on the outside, and set it on the mantelpiece without breaking the seal. They stood there, 3 letters in a row, like a small and useless parliament. She did not burn them. She did not open them. She left them where they were and went about the business of leaving. She did not go to her family seat in Lincolnshire, where her brother would have received her with sympathy and questions in equal measure. She did not go to her sister in Bath, who would have been kind and would also have told everyone. She did not go anywhere that required her to explain herself, because she was not yet ready to explain herself, because she did not yet know what had happened well enough to explain it, and she was not the sort of woman who spoke before she understood. She went to Wiltshire. The property in Wiltshire had been purchased with the settlement from her first marriage, a modest sum from a brief and affectionless union that had left her, at 29, with a widow's income, a clear opinion of what she did not want, and a house in the country that nobody had given her and nobody could take back. It was not grand. It had 6 bedrooms and a walled kitchen garden and a library that smelled of old paper. And the staff there, a housekeeper, 2 maids, a cook, and a groundsman who seemed to exist in a state of permanent mild irritation with the weather, knew her as a woman who arrived without notice and required very little, and was to be left alone when she was reading. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Farrow, took one look at the trunk and said, "I'll have your room ready within the hour, my lady." And that was the end of any conversation about why Harriet was there. Harriet instructed Mrs. Farrow that she was not receiving visitors, and that any correspondence from Fenwick House was to be accepted at the door and placed in the hall without being brought to her attention unless she specifically asked for it. Mrs. Farrow said, "Yes, my lady," and went to see about the room. The society columns in the London papers, which arrived in Wiltshire 3 days late and were therefore always reporting on a world that had already moved on, would note in time that Lady Harriet Ashwood, for she was now Ashwood, whatever else she was, had not been seen at any autumn engagements. They would not yet know why. They would speculate, because speculation was the mechanism by which society processed events it had not been invited to understand. And 300 people had been present at Fenwick Chapel, and all 300 of them had a tongue. Harriet read none of it. She read Gibbon. She read a new novel her sister had recommended before all of this happened, and which turned out to be excellent. She walked in the walled garden in the mornings when the frost was still on the grass, and she discovered, not with drama, but with a quiet and somewhat startled recognition, that she had opinions about how she liked her mornings that she had not had occasion to act on in 3 years, that she preferred silence before 10 o'clock, that she liked her tea strong and her breakfast early, and that she did not, actually, enjoy the large social breakfasts that Fenwick House required of a marchioness, and never had. She was discovering what she did with her mornings when no morning belonged to anyone else. Oliver arrived at the Wiltshire house on a Thursday, 10 days after the chapel. He had not written ahead to say he was coming, which was either a failure of courtesy or a correct assessment that she would have told him not to come. And Harriet, when Mrs. Farrow came to inform her that the Marquess of Fenwick was at the gate, took a moment before she answered. "Tell him I will receive him in the garden," Harriet said, "not inside." The garden in October was past its flowering, but not past its usefulness as a space where a woman could stand on her own ground without being surrounded by walls that belonged to someone else's history. Harriet positioned herself near the low stone wall at the garden's far end, where the view was of the fields and the afternoon light came in low and clear. And she waited. Oliver came through the garden gate looking like a man who had not slept well in 10 days, which was accurate, and who had prepared what he was going to say, which was also accurate, and which she could tell because he had the particular expression of someone carrying rehearsed sentences. She let him begin. "Harriet," he said, and stopped, and started again. "I have been. What I said in the chapel was not. I want you to understand that what I feel for you is not something I would minimize or qualify. I have never been dishonest with you about the nature of my regard. What happened in that moment was not a reflection of the marriage we have built. It was a—" He paused. "It was something I should have dealt with a long time ago and did not. And the consequence of that failure fell on you in a way that was entirely unjust, and I am more sorry than I know how to say." Harriet waited until she was certain he had finished. "Was Lady Cecily Vane in that chapel by accident?" she asked. The pause that followed was itself an answer. His expression shifted, not to guilt exactly, but to something adjacent to it. Something that looked like a man discovering that the floor he had been standing on was not quite where he thought. "My mother," he began. She said quietly, "Yes, that is what I thought." She looked at him for a moment. The afternoon light was behind him, and she could see his face clearly. And what she saw there was not a bad man. She had never thought he was a bad man. That was, in some ways, the most difficult part. "I can understand," she said, "that you loved someone before you married me. I am 34 years old. I was married before. I understand that people carry histories. I would not have asked you to be without one." She kept her voice even. "What I can't understand is a man who arranged his own wedding as a mechanism for resolving that prior love, who placed his past and his present in the same room and said nothing to either woman about what he was doing. I was not your wife in that chapel. I was a function." Oliver said, "That is not how I thought of you." "I know it isn't," Harriet said. "That may be the worst part. I believe you never thought of it in those terms at all. I believe you told yourself that marrying me was moving forward, that what you felt for me was sufficient, that the other thing would resolve itself in time. I believe all of that." She paused. "And I also believe that when the organ stopped and you saw her in that pew, 3 years of believing it was resolved proved to have been insufficient." She asked him to leave. He left. He walked back through the garden gate without another word, and she heard his horse on the road a moment later. And then the road was quiet. Harriet stood at the stone wall for a long time after the gate had closed behind him. She was aware of something changing in the quality of the afternoon. Not lighter, but less weighted, as though a question she had been carrying without naming it had been named at last and handed back to its rightful owner. She had said aloud what she had known since July and chosen not to say. It was out of her now. It lived in the air between her and Oliver and could not be put back. She went inside. The gray afternoon that Lady Cecily Vane arrived at the Wiltshire house came 3 weeks after Oliver's visit, and it arrived without warning. Mrs. Farrow came to find Harriet in the library and said, with some care, that a Lady Cecily Vane was at the door and had asked for 10 minutes. Harriet set down her book. She had known the name since July. She had not known the face. She had imagined it, which was perhaps worse. "Show her into the sitting room," Harriet said. Lady Cecily Vane was 31 years old and had the kind of face that Harriet, without rancor, recognized as genuinely beautiful. Dark-eyed, composed, with the particular stillness of a woman who had learned to hold herself carefully in rooms where her presence complicated things. She was dressed plainly for a woman of her rank, and she sat in the chair Harriet indicated and did not take the tea that Harriet offered, and she began to speak without preamble. "I did not come to defend him," Cecily said. "I want you to understand that first." "I am listening," Harriet said. "2 weeks before the wedding," Cecily said, "Oliver came to me. He asked whether I would consider, whether there was any possibility of resuming what had been between us. He was direct about it. He said he was about to marry you and that he needed to know." She stopped. "I told him no, not because of circumstance, not because my family would object or because of his rank, or any of the reasons that ended the original engagement 8 years ago. I told him no because I had made my own life, and I had no wish to undo it." Harriet was very still. "He married you, knowing I had refused him," Cecily said. The phrase in the chapel was not a man overwhelmed by the truth of what he felt. It was a man who had tried to close a door 2 weeks before the wedding and found he could not close it cleanly, and then saw me in the pews, which his mother arranged, I understand, without informing either of us, and collapsed under the weight of all of it. The sitting room was quiet. "Why are you telling me this?" Harriet said. "Because you deserve to know the precise shape of what happened," Cecily said. "Not the version where he was undone by love in a chapel. The version where he tried to resolve it privately 2 weeks before, was told no, and married you anyway, without telling you any of it." She met Harriet's eyes. "And because I read what the papers are saying, and none of it is accurate, and you should not be carrying the weight of a narrative that belongs to him." Cecily left shortly after. Harriet saw her to the door and thanked her, and the door closed, and Harriet stood in the hallway for a moment before she went out to the garden. It was raining, not heavily. The fine, persistent October rain that does not announce itself, but simply exists, cold and thorough. Harriet stood at the bench near the kitchen garden wall and let it rain on her, and did not go inside. And she was still standing there when Price came through the garden door with a wool shawl, and without a word wrapped it around Harriet's shoulders and sat down on the bench beside her. Price did not speak. She did not ask whether Harriet wanted company or whether she would prefer to be alone. She simply sat, with the rain coming down on both of them, and her presence was the first uncomplicated act of care that Harriet had received in weeks, not mediated by Oliver, not offered in the context of his household, not shaped by anyone's expectations of what a marchioness required. Harriet sat down. They sat together in the rain for a quarter of an hour. That night, past 3 o'clock, Harriet lit the candle on the writing desk and took out paper and began to write. Not the polished, measured kind of writing she did when she knew the letter would be sent. This was different. This was the writing she did when she needed to think, when the thoughts had been circling for long enough that they needed to be placed somewhere outside her own head. She wrote to Oliver. Not accusations, questions. The precise questions she had not been able to stop forming since the chapel. Had he known, when he married her, that Cecily had already refused him? Had he believed the wedding itself would resolve it? Had he looked at Harriet, standing beside him at that altar, and seen her, specifically her Harriet, the woman who preferred silence before 10 o'clock and read Gibbon for pleasure, and had stood in his Derbyshire garden and breathed cold air? Or had he seen a solution to a problem she had never been told existed? She wrote for 2 hours. When she had finished, She read it once through. Then she carried it to the grate, where the coals were still faintly warm, and she held the letter over them until it caught. She watched it burn, the pages curling, the words she had spent 2 hours finding going first orange, then black, then gray, then nothing. She watched until the last of it was ash. She went back to bed. She lay in the dark and found, to her own surprise, that the questions had gone with the letter. Not because she had answers, but because she no longer needed his answers to know what she knew. She knew it already. She had known it since July. The letter was the last of the weight she had been carrying for someone else. She closed her eyes and slept until morning. Lady Fenwick's letter arrived on a Monday, written in the Dowager's characteristic hand, large, decisive, slightly impatient with the limitations of paper. It did not ask. It informed Harriet that her continued absence from Fenwick House was causing comment, that the family name was being subjected to speculation that a prompt return would curtail, and that Lady Fenwick expected to hear from her by the end of the week. Harriet read it. She placed it with the other correspondence she was not answering, and went back to Gibbon. Lady Fenwick herself arrived on the Wednesday. She came in a carriage that announced itself from the road, and she presented herself at the door of the Wiltshire house with the manner of a woman who had not seriously considered the possibility of not being received. Mrs. Farrow came to Harriet with an expression that communicated both the fact of the arrival and a complete absence of any opinion about what should be done about it. "Tea in the sitting room," Harriet said. "I will be down directly." She received Lady Fenwick with perfect courtesy. She poured the tea herself and offered the better chair and asked after the journey. And she waited until the initial business of arrival had been completed before she folded her hands in her lap and spoke. "I know that you organized Lady Cecily Vane's presence in the chapel," Harriet said. "I understand that you believed it would settle something in Oliver, that seeing her married to another, or simply seeing that she was ordinary and present, and not the figure of memory he had made of her, would close a door you had watched him leave open for 8 years. She paused. "I understand the reasoning. I even understand the impulse. You wanted to help your son." Lady Fenwick said, "I did what I thought." "What you thought," Harriet said, "came very close to costing me my own clarity about what I had seen and chosen not to see. I had made a decision, in July, to trust the marriage I was in. Your arrangement in the chapel made it impossible to know, afterward, whether what Oliver said was something he would have said regardless, or whether it was a specific response to a specific provocation that you introduced." She looked at Lady Fenwick steadily. "I cannot unknow that. I would ask you not to return to this house without a written invitation." The silence in the sitting room was of the variety that follows a statement made without anger and without any visible desire for argument. Lady Fenwick set down her cup. She said after a moment, "You are a great deal more direct than I anticipated." Her voice was composed. "I have found it is simpler." She saw Lady Fenwick to the door with the same courtesy she had shown throughout, and the carriage departed, and Harriet closed the door and stood in the hall for a moment, noticed that she did not feel anything in particular. Not triumph, not regret, not the residue of performance. She had said what was true. It was finished. The following week, on a Tuesday morning, Harriet was leaving the Wiltshire Village Lending Library with a copy of a book she had been waiting 3 weeks for when she saw Oliver on the opposite side of the street. He was not at her house. He was not with a letter. He was simply there, on the pavement outside the apothecary, and their eyes met across the width of the street. He crossed toward her. "What are you carrying?" he asked. She turned the spine toward him so he could read the title. Any good? He said. I haven't started it yet, she said. I've been told it is. They began walking in the same direction because the street only went one way from that point, and there was no particular reason for either of them to walk the other way. They spoke about the book. They spoke about the village. He had been at the estate near Marlborough, which was close enough to account for his presence here. And she did not ask whether that was the reason he was here or whether it was incidental. They spoke about the state of the road, which was bad, and about whether the weather would hold, which it would not. They did not speak about the chapel or Cecily, or the 3 letters on the Wiltshire mantelpiece, or the separation papers that Harriet had already begun to consider. For half a mile, they walked. At the junction where the road split and their directions diverged, the autumn rains of the past week had flooded the gutter with mud, dark, cold, several inches deep and wider than a reasonable step. Harriet looked at it. Oliver extended his hand. She looked at his hand for a moment. Then she took it, and he helped her across the mud, and she was on the other side, and he released her hand. Neither of them spoke of it. Neither of them spoke of the half-mile either, or of the fact that for half a mile neither of them had walked alone. They said goodbye at the junction with the same even courtesy they had maintained throughout. And Harriet walked toward the Wiltshire house and did not look back. And she was aware, as she walked, that something had shifted, not resolved, not decided, but shifted, the way a window shifts when someone opens it an inch and you feel the air change in the room. Oliver's 4th letter arrived on a Friday morning, and it was different from the first 3 in every quality that mattered. It did not apologize. It did not explain. It described. Harriet read it at the writing desk with her 2nd cup of tea, and she read it as she read things that required attention. Slowly, with the full capacity of her mind, he described the angle of lamplight in a Derbyshire dining room 3 years ago, and the exact moment when he had seen her laugh at something genuinely funny. Not the social laugh. Not the laugh that was offered as a courtesy to a host's indifferent joke. But the real one, the one that surprised her, that broke across her face before she had decided to allow it. He described the particular quality of her attention when she was listening to an argument she had not yet decided to agree with. The slight tension at the corner of her mouth, the way her eyes moved when she was working through a proposition rather than simply receiving it. He wrote that he had known, on the morning of the chapel, the precise moment she understood what he had said. Not because she turned toward him, but because she did not. Because she looked forward for 3 counted seconds, and in those 3 seconds he had seen her make a decision, and he had understood, watching her walk away, that the decision was irrevocable and correct and entirely his own fault. He did not ask for anything. He said only what he had lost that morning and named it precisely. Not the marriage, not the title, not the arrangement of their lives. Her specifically. The woman who needed air before she knew she needed it, and who packed her own trunk, and who received his mother with perfect courtesy and asked her not to return, and who was now, presumably, reading this letter with the same expression she used when she was working through a proposition rather than simply receiving it. Harriet read it twice. She folded it along its original creases. She placed it in the writing desk. She did not send a reply, but she did not burn it. 3 weeks later, Oliver submitted a formal written request for a private meeting, phrased with the care of a man who had understood that informality was no longer available to him. He did not name a location, which was itself a form of deference. He was placing the choice where it belonged. Harriet wrote back with a single sentence. She would receive him at Fenwick House, not at the Wiltshire property. She named the date. She arrived at Fenwick House the day before. She had not been there since the morning after the chapel. She went through each room once, not with sentiment, but with the deliberateness of a woman who was reacquainting herself with a place she had once thought she knew and was now examining on different terms. The rooms were the same. The light through the east windows was the same October light, 1 year on. The housekeeper welcomed her back without comment, because Mrs. Alderton was a woman of considerable intelligence and knew when comment was not useful. That evening, Harriet sat at the writing desk in the upstairs study and took out the legal separation document that her solicitor had prepared at her instruction. She read it once. She signed where her signature was required. She placed it in its envelope and carried it downstairs to the low table beside the chair where she intended to sit the following morning. Then she went to bed, and she lay in the dark of Fenwick House, and she was aware that she had arranged the room very carefully, and that the arrangement was her own. Oliver arrived at 11 o'clock on a Thursday morning in October, 1 year and 3 days after the chapel. The Fenwick House saloon was lit by the east windows, and the light was the same quality it had been on the morning of the wedding. Clear, cold, without warmth. Harriet was already seated when he was shown in, and the separation document in its envelope was on the low table between them, visible and unambiguous. He stopped when he saw it. Stopped when he had prepared a long apology. She could see that it was prepared. She could see the shape of it in the way he stood, the way he had organized himself for this conversation. She did not want the apology. She had not come here for the apology. "Before you say what you have prepared to say," Harriet said, "I have one question." He waited. "If Cecily had not been in that pew," Harriet said, "would you have said those words?" The silence that followed was not the silence of a man who did not know the answer. It was the silence of a man who knew the answer and was confronting the full weight of what it meant. It lasted long enough that it ceased to be a pause and became, instead, a reply. Both of them understood what it said. Harriet picked up the envelope. She withdrew the final document, the one that required her signature on the last page, the signature she had not yet placed. She signed it. She set it back on the table. She rose. "Harriet." His voice was not the voice of the prepared apology. It was different, stripped of preparation, stripped of the careful architecture of what he had planned to say. "What did you want from this marriage?" She had taken 2 steps toward the door. She stopped. "Not what I assumed you wanted," Oliver said. "Not what the marriage required of you. Not what a marchioness is supposed to want, or what a second wife is supposed to want, or what anyone around you expected you to want. What did you specifically want?" The room was very quiet. Harriet stood with her back to him. She was aware of the quality of the question, the fact that it was the first time in 3 years anyone had asked it, the fact that it was the first time he had asked it, the fact that it was, in its simplicity, the question that all of the other conversations had circled without ever reaching. She was aware that it had arrived late. She was aware that she had also, in her own way, failed to ask it of herself, that she had managed the marriage and measured the marriage and assessed the marriage without ever quite asking herself what she had wanted it to be. She turned. "If you had asked me that question 3 years ago," she said, "none of what is on that table would exist." "I know," Oliver said. The distance between them was small. It was the distance of a room that was not large, of 2 people who had moved, over the course of a conversation, to its center. Harriet looked at him. Not with the measuring look of the past year, not with the careful assessment of a woman deciding what to permit, but with something more direct than either of those. She crossed the distance. She kissed him, once deliberate, chosen with the same precision she brought to everything she decided. And then she stepped back and looked at him as though she was completing a calculation she had been working on for a very long time. "I have not withdrawn the document," she said. His voice was quiet. "I know that too." "Good," said Harriet. A year later, Fenwick House in October, the same east light coming through the same windows, and the grounds outside in full autumn color, the elms and the beeches, and the long grass of the lower fields all turned to the colors of the season, the same colors as the morning she had walked out of the chapel and into the light. The supper that evening was small. No guests, no staff remaining in the room after the plates were cleared. Just the two of them. And the fire, and the quiet that had become, over the course of this second year, a different quality of quiet from the one that had existed in the first. Not the quiet of things unspoken. The quiet of people who had said what needed saying and were no longer required to fill the silence with management. Oliver extinguished the last lamp himself. In the morning, the east light came early. 2 cups of tea on the breakfast table, steam rising in the cool air. And between them, in its original envelope, sealed as it had been when Harriet first placed it on the low table in the saloon, the separation document. Signed by Harriet's hand. Never submitted, never carried to any court or solicitor's office. It had sat in this house for a year in the way that certain objects sit in houses, not as monuments, not as weapons, but as facts. The fact that it contained was simple. She could leave. She had not left. The choice was hers. Renewed each morning, she did not make the other one. "The Marlborough Road will be flooded again by Thursday," Oliver said, looking at the window. "The Marlborough Road is always flooded by October," Harriet said. "You know this." "I continue to find it surprising." She set down her cup. "You find it surprising every year. It is not surprising." He looked at her over his cup, and she looked back at him, and the voices between them were easy in the way that voices become easy when they have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side speaking plainly. Outside, the Fenwick grounds held the October light in the way they always did. The long shadows of the elms, the pale gold of the grass, the stone walls running down toward the lower fields. The same light that had come through the chapel doors a year ago when they were still open, the same light that had come through the carriage window when Harriet rode away alone in silence. It came through the breakfast room window now and fell across the table between them, across the 2 cups of tea, across the envelope with its document inside, and it was simply light. The ordinary, clear, unapologetic light of an October morning at Fenwick House. Harriet reached across the table for the marmalade. Oliver passed it to her before she asked. She noticed. She did not remark on it. She spread the marmalade on her toast and looked out at the grounds and drank her tea. And the morning continued in the way that mornings continue when they belong to the people who are living them. Quietly, and with the particular warmth of a choice made freely, made again.